Welcome to Behind the Thin Blue Line, a Whisper in the Shadows podcast. In each city, in every neighbourhood, on every street, they stand tall. Those in blue, guardians of our community, our protectors. But who are they really? Behind the Thin Blue Line is the podcast that takes you behind the badge, beyond the headlines, and into the hearts of those who serve and protect. We're here to break down barriers and to tear down the walls of misunderstanding. We're here to listen to their stories, their triumphs, their fears. Ever wonder what it's like serving undercover? Or what's the real-life impact of policing? Or how they cope with trauma? Listen as we step into the shoes of those who walk the thin blue line. You have heard my true stories of what it's really like to be an undercover cop. I want to give a voice to all those living amongst us, unseen and unnoticed, who have put their life on the line being a police officer. Hopefully to give you, the listener, a glimpse into something you will likely never get to experience. Uncover the complex world of law enforcement and the raw human experiences behind the badge. Join me, Jason Somerville, your host and a former police officer myself, as we navigate through these stories on Behind the Thin Blue Line. Let's go and meet our next guest. Welcome to Behind the Thin Blue Line, a Whisper in the Shadows podcast where I explore the human side of policing and law enforcement. I hope you're enjoying our conversations with former and current police officers and delving into the complexity of policing, and how it affects the human side of police as a person. I'm Jason Somerville, and I was a Queensland police officer for nearly 14 years, as well as an undercover cop for 2 of those years. You will have been listening to my stories of my time undercover through my alter ego, Michael Bates. Well, I've decided it's time we heard from other cops and let them tell their stories. Today, I'm chatting with Greg Kingston, who is a current serving police officer in Australia and who also worked as both general duties and surveillance in the United Kingdom. Good afternoon, Greg. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. And yourself?
Mate, I cannot complain. It is almost time to sit down and watch the news.
Yep.
Thank you for agreeing to join the podcast and for agreeing to have a chat about your policing experiences.
You're welcome.
Now, what I always like to do is start off with our guests giving us a brief overview of their career to date, where they started, what they did, etc. Given you've got 2 careers, I guess we'll start at the beginning and work to where you are now.
Yeah. So I joined Kent Police in England in 19. Yep. I was just approaching 26 years old at the time, and I worked at 2 police stations doing general duties policing. Dover, which is a port town, closest port to France, to Europe. Yep. So that was very busy. And then my partner and then wife, Katie, was a police officer in London. So we made the decision to move closer to London, and I then moved up to a place or a town called Dartford, which is nearly an outer suburb of London now, but very close to London. So again, very busy.
When you say very close to London, so are we talking 2 hours or?
No, we're talking 15 minutes. Really.
Oh, okay.
You could be in one of the outer boroughs of London in 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
So quite a lot of cross-border crime between both Kent criminals going into London and then London criminals coming out.
Okay.
So yeah, the 4 years general duties. During my time at Dover, we had a guy come to our team, our general duties team, that had been on the surveillance team.
Yeah.
And while he wasn't very forthcoming with a lot of information, as I'm sure you and the listeners, viewers can imagine, it piqued my interest to follow that, if I could follow that kind of career path.
Is there a reason he wasn't very forthcoming about?
More because of they're quite secretive about the tactics that they use.
Yep.
And some of the operations were still ongoing, particularly where we were working. So he didn't want to give away who we were looking at, because you know what general duties coppers are like. They like to get involved in stuff they shouldn't do. So
and gossip.
Yes, exactly. So he gave enough away that piqued my interest.
Yep. Oh, so he was actually still working there. He's not like he came back to general duties.
Yeah, no, he was. He came back to general duties.
Oh, okay, yep.
So he had been a surveillance officer, was kind of winding down and just wanted something a little bit more consistent time-wise.
Yep.
And came to general duties for his last few years.
Okay.
So, yeah, I was quite fortunate that a sergeant on promotion came to my team at Dover from the intelligence unit. And we then worked extremely closely with the intel unit, which led to some, it wasn't unauthorised foot surveillance, but we would do some operations in the town. And we ended up catching one of the better known local drug dealers with a fairly substantial amount of heroin. And again, that just kind of really piqued my interest and made me want to pursue a career or certainly a position with the surveillance team. So after 2 years at Dover, I then moved up to Dartford, and during my time at Dartford, I completed a UC course. It was a test purchase course rather than a UC. So you weren't a full UC, but you did some of the UC course. And I then deployed a number of times as a test purchaser against drug dealers and people with stolen property and stuff like that.
What do you mean by a test purchaser? Sorry.
So you would pretend to be someone you weren't.
Yeah.
As you've said previously. And you would contact people that we knew were selling drugs, and you'd eventually try and persuade them to meet you and sell you drugs. Or you'd go to, stolen cars. People were selling them on what the Facebook wasn't about them, but you get wind of people that were selling stolen cars, so you would go along and have a look at the car and find out where it came from, etc., and just build up that evidence picture. And if you ended up buying the car, you'd drive away with it, and that was your evidence to then go back and arrest them.
So it was almost like buy busts in a general.
Buy busts, yeah. So a very short term, almost a very short term UC role.
Yep. Okay.
But
did you enjoy that?
I did, yeah. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I was deemed what was probably a little bit too clean cut for the heroin trade.
Yeah.
So I never really went against heroin. So it was more cocaine, the higher end drugs, cocaine, ecstasy, that kind of thing. But the test purchases I did, were for not reasonably high end cars, but some certainly nice cars. But on one occasion, I got scruffed up as a gardener and went in and bought £1,000, so a couple of $1,000 lawnmower, which had been stolen from a local place, and we knew this place was selling dodgy gear. So it wasn't just lawnmowers; it was generally that kind of stuff, but it was a dodgy second-hand place. But the unit that ran the test purchase team was also part of what was called the Central Operations Group, which had the surveillance team under its banner as well. And again, I was aware that there were surveillance officers watching me when I was completing test purchases. And they would then take away the baddie when I went off with the vehicle or the drugs. They would then follow. So again, it was all kind of leading to, just pursuing that surveillance role more. And then midway through 2002, an advert came out for the surveillance team, which I applied for, went through a fairly rigorous assessment process, which involved a number of tests over the weekend, both individually and as a team, to see how you would get on. Including driving around at extremely high speed through the British countryside, the English countryside, to try and make you sick.
And were you?
I wasn't. No, I've actually got a reasonably strong stomach. But I have been in cars when I then became a surveillance officer, and we do those same assessments where we were successful in making some of the poor guys and girls stop the car and open the door. So then late 2002, I completed a national level 1 surveillance course, but it was run in-house by Kent officers who were level 1 trainers. And at the end of that, I was successful in obtaining a position on the surveillance team.
So you did the hard yards. You basically built your career with that goal in mind.
I did. I was never entirely sure I was going to get there, because it was always deemed as being a bit of a dead man's shoes spot. That once you were in, you almost get carried out in a box. Or it was jobs for the boys. So if you knew someone that knew someone or that kind of thing, then you were more likely to get a spot. But they struggled for a time to get officers to join the surveillance team and it kind of opened out a little bit more. And some of those of us that thought we might never get there got there, and I stayed for 12 years eventually.
And now you're currently sitting in. I'll let you decide whether you want to say which state and where you're sitting. How did that all come about?
So, my mum's Australian. She was born and bred, raised in Sydney.
Yep.
She left on a boat with a friend of hers in the late 60s. Met my dad in Canada. They got married and ended up living back in the UK. So I've got or had Australian citizenship from birth. I've visited a number of times through the 70s, 80s and 90s. And I came out after I'd finished school in the early 90s and spent a good number of months in Sydney and eventually went back. It was kind of tight. It was a recession time. Things were quite tough.
Yeah.
So I went back to the UK, but always kind of felt that I wanted to come back and at least try and live in Oz if I could. But then, as I said, joined the police mid-20s, and life just gets under you then, doesn't it? You know, you're working, you then get married, you buy a house, you have kids, and you kind of think, well, it's never going to happen. And I just chanced to see a friend on Facebook, of all things, in uniform, which is where I am.
Yep.
And I hadn't seen him for a number of years because my role in surveillance, and he, as it turned out, been out here. We reconnected, and he was actually applying to come back to WA again. He'd been out here once and left the police here, gone back to my old force in Kent, and was applying to come back out. And I went home from work one day and said to the wife, what do you reckon about moving to Australia? She'd never been before, but said, yeah, give it a go, kind of half tongue-in-cheek, thinking, yeah, it'll never happen. And a few months later, we were getting on the plane with 2 kids, and here we are 10 years later.
Yeah, because at WA Pol, they went through a really lean time of getting people, and the only people they could get were qualified people from the UK, which meant, and I don't mean this in a bad way, that just about anyone who applied from the UK, provided that you didn't have any real issues. QPOL did the same thing, and VicPol did the same thing as well. You know, you got a job basically.
Yes. Yep. So yeah, again, it was a relatively rigorous assessment process.
Yep.
I was initially told, because I'm an Australian citizen, that I would have had to come to Perth, but I must have said something right to one of the recruitment ladies, because they managed to fit me on the assessment process in London. So we had a fitness test and interview. We then had to do exams as well, so the problem solving, English and maths.
Yep.
Which I believe they've got rid of now.
Oh, have they?
Yes. Yeah. It literally, I think it is an interview. You have to do a psych test, the fitness test, and complaints history. And if you pass all of that, you basically get a visa nomination.
It's not like you need to be able to understand English or reason or anything like that, is it?
Not really, no. But I wonder whether part of that is, they're lowering standards to maybe increase the numbers. I'm not saying those that are coming out are thick as a plank of wood, but
I was going to say, being honest, the majority of forces / services around the country are losing members at a high rate of knots. You know, we may get into that, we may not, but there is a huge attrition rate for a number of reasons. So I guess when that happens, you have to lower the standard. I mean, when I went through, the standards were lowered because they had to have an intake of 400 people.
Wow. Yep.
Now, is that how I get in? Some people will say yes, other people will say no. But we had people in there who openly had juvie records and those sorts of things. They got weeded out over the 12-month process, but still, that's how far the standards had dropped, because we were taking people, just about anyone, because they had such a huge intake. Now, question in regards to the difference between the policing. Obviously, in the UK, when you're in uniform, you don't wear a firearm, a sidearm.
No. The only thing Australia? I had, the only thing I had when I initially joined was a metal stick and some Hurty pepper spray, and that was it. We didn't have tasers, and in fact, I believe not every copper in the UK carries a taser still.
Wow.
there might be 2 or 3 on the team that are trained and authorised to use it or carry it anyway. So, and I think that's where a lot of UK coppers succeed in coming over to Australia, particularly because without that use of force option, i.e. firearm or taser, you've got to use your mouth to get out of a lot of situations. It's all well and good having a big metal stick and a bit of spray, but it doesn't work on everybody. So you had to be good at talking to people to get yourself out of situations or resolve a situation. And I remember going through the interview process for Waypol in Australia House in London, and I had never had a complaint when I applied to join Waypol. So 16 years in the place, never had a complaint. And the inspector there said, "How the hell have you got through?" And I said, "Well, I always wanted to come in with the attitude that I want to treat people the way I would expect to be treated. So I was never one that was going in fists up, ready for a fight. I would always want to talk to people and find out what and why and how we could help, or what was going to be the easiest way to get people in the back of the car or whatever. It didn't always work, but you give it a go, and if it succeeds, then it's a better situation, I think, than just going fist in and having all sorts of problems.
Oh, most definitely. How long have you been in Australia now? Sorry,
10 years.
Have you had any complaints?
I had one. Stupidly, it was when I was on liquor enforcement. And we were dealing with a situation outside a nightclub, and it got quashed. To be honest, it never went anywhere, and it was just about the way that these people have been spoken to. It wasn't a use of force issue.
No, and I guess where I was going with that was that it seems to me that here in Australia, people complain about the police a lot more for trivial things like, they were rude to me. I had a complaint. I was lying on the ground struggling with a 6'8" Samoan. And a girl came up to me and said, I think someone's stolen my phone. And I'm lying in the middle of the street struggling with this guy trying to arrest me. And I allegedly turned to her and said, "How about you fuck off?" Mind you, the video shows it clearly, but I still deny I said it. But the point is, do you know what I mean? It's like there seems to be a lot more. What's the word? People do it because we've made a big thing out of it with the various crime and misconduct commissions around the country.
Yep. And I think people these days are too quick to make a complaint rather than actually looking at their own behaviour and thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't have pestered that copper while he was wrestling on the ground.
Yeah.
And did I deserve to be told where to go? Yeah, probably. But I'll make a complaint because it makes me feel better.
Yeah, well, it is. It got looked at and they said, "Yeah, right, fair enough. Maybe you shouldn't have sworn." I said, "I didn't. I told her to go away." So now you're finishing up, you said, very soon?
I will be, yes. So probably end of September, early October, I'll be leaving Waypol.
And why is that?
So my wife started a business in 2020, which has just become more and more successful year on year. It's a canteen catering business that currently operates in 19 school canteens in the south of Perth area.
Yep.
We're getting more inquiries all the time. So I'm part-time at the moment, have been for the last 3 years. Initially to help out with my daughter who was diagnosed with autism around 2020 as well. And she had therapies through the school day that my wife couldn't always leave her work for. So we kind of reversed roles. She went full-time and I went part-time, but I've kind of ended up working more for the business than running my daughter around. So
it's just easier to leave the police.
Yeah, it is. It's either I leave the place and come across and help my wife full time, or we pay someone to do what I'm doing. And given how much the business has grown and continues to grow, it just makes sense for me to leave and take the opportunity to go full time and run the business.
And that's fair enough. I just want to circle back to something we were talking about in regards to the difference, not having a firearm and then having a firearm. Did that concern you when you first started working in Western Australia that, or Perth, that you had to carry a firearm?
It didn't, and I think that probably goes back to the fact that I was an authorised firearms officer for my surveillance role.
Yep.
So I undertook firearms training in 2019 for the Glock. It wasn't a routine carry. It was only when we had intelligence that either the subject we were following or any associates of his had ready access to firearms that we would carry. And I think in the 5 years following my course, I probably only carried 5 or 6 times. It wasn't very regular at all.
Okay. So
I was used to handling and carrying a firearm.
Do you think it makes a difference to how the public interact with you?
It's certainly a point of talk, of conversation.
Yeah.
But I also think that Australians are used to seeing coppers with firearms. So for everyday Australians, it's not a big issue.
Yep.
I think for the UK cops or anyone from the Commonwealth countries that comes across that haven't carried firearms, I think it is certainly something that you have at the back of your mind, probably more than the local recruits. But so it never bothered me. And all of the what they call the transitional officers that have come across, they've not had an issue with it. It's just another tool of the job, really.
It is.
It's like your phone. It's like your baton. It's there if you need to use it. Touch wood, I've never had to draw it in anger, and hopefully that stays the case before I go.
Like I used to hate. What's the best way of putting this? It used to scare me that I had to carry it.
Yeah,
but I was glad it was there.
Yes,
because I have had to pull it out and point it at someone.
Yep.
And so at that stage, I was glad it was there. But it used to scare me having to carry it because it was like, you don't want to have this thing here where you might actually have to use it on someone.
It's a massive responsibility, and the consequences if you have to draw it and fire it. We all know, of coppers, and it's well documented in the news. What happens to coppers that do shoot people these days.
Yes,
and I often think, I'm fairly convinced now that any copper that shoots someone, regardless of the circumstances, the outcome will always be politically motivated, because the executive in the police forces don't want to be the ones to say, we're not charging him because of this, we'll let the court do it. So they will charge the copper, put the copper through the ringer for a number of years before it gets resolved and either a finding of guilty or not guilty comes through. And I think, that's the way it's going at the moment.
I agree, and that probably has a big bearing on why there are so many people leaving the various police forces around the country. All right, let's change tack a little bit. What did you want to be when you were growing up?
I didn't have a clue, to be honest.
Yeah.
I left school. So I went through my last couple of years at school. I did A-levels in sports studies and business studies.
Yep.
And my intention on leaving school was to take a year out, do the travel, which I did, came over to Australia, as I said, in the early 90s.
That's like a gap year, yeah?
Yeah. And I had all intentions of going back to the UK at some point, whether it was 6 months or a year later, and doing some kind of sports degree, whether that was in sports management, sports centre management, something like that. Never, you see the emergency services, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a policeman, I want to do this when you're growing up, 7, 8, 9, 10, but kind of tongue-in-cheek. But I didn't leave school wanting to be a police officer. As I said, when I got back from Australia, it was in the middle of a recession, and the only job I could find was in real estate, of all things, which was suffering probably the most of anything at the time during that financial crisis. And I just kind of bumbled from different company to different company. And it got to the point where I was probably 24, I suppose, and I thought, I can't just keep doing this for the rest of my life. I wasn't enjoying the job particularly.
Yep.
It was very cutthroat. The pay was pretty crap for the hours that you were doing. And I'd had a few friends join the police from school, and I'd kept in touch with them, and we'd often catch up and talk about, particularly one guy, I talked to him, and he was still very complimentary of the police at that time. The late 90s, I think we were still seen as people to be respected. I don't think we are now, but I think that respect from the public has probably dwindled over the years.
Why do you think that is?
I think they look at coppers as having the power, and they don't like people having the power over them. I think the days of like the Facebook mentality, as you were saying earlier, people are too quick to make a complaint rather than stepping back and actually looking at the bigger picture and what has happened.
Yep.
And yeah, I think it's all too easy to criticise and have not hatred, but have maybe a disrespect of people trying to do the job. Although, having said that, I do feel that the public in Australia, when I certainly came across in 2014, it shocked me to a degree. I was walking along a street when I was doing my driver training,
Yeah.
and people were saying hello to us, and it wasn't forced. It was, they were genuine. How you going, and that kind of thing. And it did take me by surprise because you wouldn't have got that in England at all.
And that's right. Look, I think one of the big things that I've sort of over the years, and it's been 20 years since I've been out. One of the big things is, I guess, a lack of police promoting what they do, police talking about themselves in a positive sense.
Yeah.
Anyone talking about police in a positive sense, it's always negative, negative, negative.
Yeah.
And I personally believe that has a lot to do with the slide in public confidence, the slide in public awareness of police, if that's the right way of putting it.
Yep. Yep. And the media as well are very quick to jump on the negative. I can't believe the news stations here. I know WA is not a particularly busy state with things, but they're on everything quicker than you could shake a stick at. And generally, it's, they want the kind of the big ticket items, which generally is going to be something serious that's happened, and it's going to be the headline grabbers. And it's not normally the policeman rescued the cat from the tree. It's going to be the police chased down this person and this person crashed and they're injured.
Yeah.
So
the person ran from the police.
Exactly.
Or why the person ran. And that's a much bigger thing. But I guess part of me doing this whole conversation interview series is to try and get out there to people to say, police are real people. They've got things that probably impact them more than what other people have in their daily life. And maybe, most of them went into the job with good intentions and came out of the job with good intentions.
Yeah.
All right. So we spoke about how you became a police officer, and we spoke about how you got into surveillance. What I might do is sort of move on to things about when people think of surveillance, they generally think of, people sitting in vans or shadowy people hiding, watching what's going on, or tapping phones and sitting there with headphones on going, oh, I've got them.
Yeah.
What do you think some of the common myths about being in surveillance are?
Oh, I think probably the biggest one is that you're always on the go.
Yep.
Your subject is always on the move and you never stop. Whereas in reality, you could sit in the car for 8 hours and read the paper, have a coffee, and maybe even close your eyes for a little bit of time and not see your subject all day. But there's stuff going on behind the scenes that, will assist us to understand what the subject's doing and when things are likely to get busy. And you've got, as a surveillance officer, you've got to have that ability to switch on at the drop of a hat. You might have sat there for 8 hours and be expecting to be told, right, we're done for the day, let's all go home. And, at 7 hours and 59 minutes, the subject comes out of the door and you're on the go for another 8, 10, 12 hours. And you don't know where you're going to end up at the end of the day. There's numerous times we used to have, I suppose they're called go bags, but you'd have a bag in the boot of the car which would have a change of clothes and fresh undies and toiletries and that kind of thing, because numerous times we would start the day and we'd end up in another part of the country and there's no way we were getting back to home base before a reasonable time had passed.
Very much hurry up and wait.
Definitely. But when it goes, it's the best job in the world.
Yeah,
it really was.
Now, I know you've got some examples of that, and we'll come to that in shortly. I just want to explore a couple of other things. Breaking into houses, not breaking into houses, sorry. Okay, breaking into houses or entering houses and tapping, putting in phone taps, drilling holes in walls, put cameras in and that sort of stuff. Does that all happen?
It did. It does.
Yeah.
I wasn't involved in that. The closest I got to that was putting devices on vehicles to follow them without actually having a vehicle behind them, which everybody knows about. It's no secret. But we had a different team that was exceptionally highly trained that would break into houses and not leave a trace. And, they'd be doing things with phones and recording devices that the movies pretty well cover these days. So it's not a trade secret anymore. But yeah, it does happen. But there's a big circle of security around those guys that are doing that, because you can't have them compromised at any point.
No, this is very true.
As a surveillance officer, my role wasn't to do that element. It was to provide the security, that part of that ring around the outside of them. And I don't mean sitting outside the front door watching. I mean, we would either take the subject away or we would provide a barrier between the location, the vehicle, whatever, and the guys doing the bits.
What was the most difficult part of doing surveillance, apart from the hurry up and waiting?
My wife always says to me, if we hadn't moved to Australia, we probably would have been divorced by now, because as a young family, and my wife was a police officer in London as well.
Yep.
She couldn't rely on me for childcare at all, because Monday to Friday, and then we were on call every other weekend. I didn't know when I was going to start and when I was going to finish, so I couldn't be around. And I think that's the biggest thing, is the takeaway from the family. The days where we don't do long hours, it's great because you're home, but that's few and far between.
Yeah. So it's a single man's game.
It is, or you've got to have a very supportive partner. And I was very lucky that my wife was supportive. As I say, she was a police officer as well. But when our first and then second child came along, it was a big burden on her. Although she went part-time herself, she was still travelling from where we lived into London, which was probably an hour each way for her minimum.
Yeah.
So she was working, 12-hour days, and then having to worry about the kids and, the kids before she went to work, and then when she got home from work. So, yeah, it's a massive impact on your personal life. And, unless you've got someone that can support you in the way that my wife did, it's really not a married stroke family person's game.
And that's fair enough. Undercover's probably very similar. The undercover that we did was probably very similar as well.
Yeah.
What's something surprising you've learned about yourself doing policing?
I think maybe I'm not the biggest, toughest, roughest guy out there. I was never a fighter at school. I'd always rather walk away from something unless I had to.
Yeah.
But also my mental resilience going into it. I'd never seen a dead person. I'd never dealt with copious amounts of blood. I'd never had to kind of, as they say, you take someone's liberty and you get the sob stories, and probably a little bit of a softie, and you might fall for them every so often. But I think you kind of have to detach yourself from the person that you are outside of work and compartmentalize what you see at work is what work is.
Yeah.
And then, when you go home, you kind of keep that to yourself, unless, as I said, my wife was a police officer and she saw some pretty grotty things herself. So I was able to offload on her as she was able to offload on me. But it's not something that you talk to your mates about, what you've seen at a road accident, or, someone hanging out of a roof hatch with a rope around their neck and that kind of thing. So having been, maybe a softie at school and growing, that was one of my concerns, was how I would deal with those more difficult, darker issues that you encounter as a police officer, yet still trying to remain, human with those that you have arrested. And, I always wanted to be as fair as I could. And I think I've achieved that through nearly 26 years, or over 26 years now.
Sorry, go on.
So you see some things through this career that you don't anticipate you're going to see when you first join. It's one of those things that happens, and that you're likely to see it. But when you do come across it, I remember the first time I saw a dead body, and it was an old lady in a nursing home. So it wasn't anything gruesome. It was
Yeah.
this little old lady lying in a bed, and all I could think about was my nana, who was about the same age and lived probably 10 minutes away. Unfortunately, I could go and give her a hug after I'd been to that job.
Yeah.
But, it's just, the first time you see it, it takes, a little bit of getting used to, and you do become a little bit, not blasé,
Desensitized.
Desensitized, definitely.
Okay, so and this is what I find really interesting. How did you learn to cope with those sorts of? Okay, you become desensitized over a period of time. My first dead body was way worse than a little old lady in a bed dying at
Yep.
home. Well, my second was probably twice as bad as well.
Yep.
How did you learn to cope with those sorts of things? You talked about compartmentalizing. Was there anything else you did?
At the time, I was fairly big into cycling,
Yeah.
and that was my release. So when I got the opportunity, certainly before kids, I would just get on the bike, and I would not punish myself, but I would push myself to the limit, just to kind of not exercise the demons, but just kind of wear myself out to the point where, I was absolutely exhausted. And that is exercise really was my way of dealing with it, I think.
Was it exercise? And let me know if we get too deep here, because
No,
you were just talking about the fact that you did this until you wore yourself out and you pushed yourself.
Yeah.
And my initial thoughts is that you did that so you were tired and you can get some sleep.
Yep. And that, probably looking back now, that was probably exactly it.
Yeah.
I would go out and I would not hurt myself, but I would push myself to the point where I was physically exhausted, and I'd get off the bike and sometimes just collapse because my legs were gone. But I never found alcohol was a great help.
No.
I wasn't a big drinker and still not a big drinker. I enjoy a drink, but it wasn't something that I turned to because I'd seen a dead body or dealt with a nasty situation. And as I say, the exercise was the one thing that I used to just kind of get out and just get away from everything. It was me and the bike and the fresh air. And it gave me thinking time as well. I'd often find myself thinking back to either events of the day or, previous weeks, even years gone by. And it was a good way of kind of decompressing as well, I think, because you could talk to yourself while you're riding the bike. You could work things through on your brain. I probably look like some kind of weirdo riding along before the days of, Bluetooth stuff.
Yep.
So yeah, it was just a good way of getting out and resolving the situation in my head before it then became an issue, at home or at work, or with friends.
Now, this question is probably more around being in uniform and everyday interaction with people, but working what you've done, you would have had to deal with people in different levels and different ways as well. Do you think that any of the things you've experienced has had an impact on how you've dealt with people?
I'd like to say no.
Yeah.
Because, as I said earlier, when I've put the uniform on, I've always wanted to treat everybody with the respect that they deserve, and I expect that respect back. You don't always get it, but I haven't let situations that I've dealt with previously kind of cloud my judgment into how I treat somebody else.
What if you don't get that, and you've said, you expect respect back.
Yep.
If you're not getting that, what buttons does that push? And we don't have to talk about this if you don't want.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It pushes the wrong ones for sure. Because you're asking people to do things, they're not doing it, or they're giving you a gobful of abuse. So I found at the beginning of COVID, it's a fairly good example, I think. My tolerance level, because I was in an office, I was working at firearms licensing.
Yeah.
Beginning of COVID, we got turfed out of the office because they deemed it not to be an essential service at the time, was put back in uniform, went to man what we called regional roadblocks. So people weren't allowed to move outside their region in WA. And if you wanted to, you had to get basically a passport and authority to go. And it ended up that the OIC of the station I was at asked us if we'd mind doing some tasking, so the guys that were tasking could have a break and go to the roadblocks, because it was a fairly easy gig sitting on your backside for 10 hours checking everyone was coming through with the right authority. And we went to a domestic where the guy had gone wandering off with his kid in a pair of boxers, I believe it was. And she came out of the side door and just gave us a mouthful of abuse before we'd even said hello to her. And I just lost it. And I just went back off her. And there was a few Fs and a few Jeffs thrown in there.
Yep.
And she looked at me, called me an old C, told me that I wasn't allowed in the house, which I was quite happy about. My younger colleague was allowed in and managed to resolve the situation. But it was just my tolerance level for people's own issues that aren't police issues. You know, everybody has an argument, and I get domestic violence is a massive issue across the world, really, not just Australia. You know, we're not alone in that problem. But it was, you know, it was a stupid argument, and she'd actually thrown a thong at him, which had gone through a front window, which she was then trying to claim he'd thrown at her, and all sorts of things. You know, the
Must
typical.
have been a big thong.
It was one of those reef things, I think. So
Oh,
fairly weighty. And my tolerance level had gone.
Okay, so we've run out of time for part one of the conversation with Greg Kingston, and we'll leave this episode here. Join us next week for part two of my conversation with Greg Kingston, and we talk about how policing has affected him and what he's going to do next. Thank you for joining me on Behind the Thin Blue Line, where I have conversations with current and former police officers, and they get to tell their stories. I hope you've enjoyed that episode. In the next episode, we'll again explore the human side of policing through more conversations with police officers from around the world. Please make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Lastly, if you're a current or former police officer, I would love to chat to you about your experiences, or if you're feeling dangerous, tell your stories on my podcast. Please get in contact by my email, which is whisperintheshadowspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to you joining me next week.